Hello, in this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with the cultural historian Dr. Robyne Calvert, formerly Mackintosh Research Fellow at the Glasgow School of Art, about her recent book The Mac, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the Glasgow School of Art, published with Yale University Press this year.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Robyne Calvert, author, now academic and other things, about her wonderful new book, The Mac, published with Yale University Press. Actually, to give the book its full title, The Mac, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the Glasgow School of Art, which you published this year. But before we get to that, Robyne, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Sure. So let's see. Dr. Robyne Calvert. I am these days, and for a while now, I've said I am a cultural historian. And that's because I have background in history of art, but I then went into design and architectural history. I guess so. This is going to sound so wanky. I have degrees in history of art. Then master's in history of art and architecture, an MLit in design, decorative arts and design history, and a PhD in history of art. And my PhD, I wrote about fashion history. So I do art, architecture, design, fashion. And I got tired of saying which hat I was wearing and which room I was in. And one day I was doing some BBC media stuff and I thought, cultural historian, that says it all. Now I don't have to explain myself. And now what's super fun is I've been asked recently to do radio spots on like pop culture and things like that. So it actually has allowed me to do whatever I want in a way. So that's who I am in terms of my, I guess, academic titles. I've worked at the University of Glasgow and Glasgow School of Art in the past, where you and I delightfully worked together many, many years ago, Ambrose. Originally I am from Miami, the sweltering metropolis, where I wanted to get out at the earliest opportunity, but now realize it actually kind of really informed in ways I didn't know, because design and Art Deco and all of that kind of stuff, I think, fed in, as well as things like a small anecdote, which I'll wrap all of this up then. I remember while I was teaching at GSA, when I got the job, I remember being asked to start teaching Mackintosh. Okay, great. Victorian architecture, great. And we need you to do another class. What could you do? And I went, American architecture. I'm American. And then I had to go study American architecture to teach it. And which I'm not sure everybody knew. I was like cramming. But anyway, obviously I knew the basics, but I was blown away by the fact that like the whole City Beautiful movement and all of that actually built Coral Gables, where I grew up. And like, I was like, oh, I totally get this because I grew up in George Merrick and all of these things. So I think it was always sort of feeding into the journey, but mostly the journey was to get as far away from Miami and the heat as I could. And here I am in Scotland.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. So what you did this PhD in fashion.
Yeah.
What period of fashion?
So basically, before that, I did these two master's degrees, and that was related to Charles Rennie Mackintosh, mostly more so his wife, Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh. I wrote on the gesso panels for one of my MLit, and then the master's at University of Oregon. I lived in Oregon for a while, and I'll give a shout out because University of Oregon is a great school of architecture, actually. But there I wrote about Mackintosh's tea rooms. I'm telling you this because as I was learning and kind of getting my expertise on the floor, became really fascinated by the way they dressed, and particularly Charles Rennie Mackintosh's floppy bow tie, and that Margaret MacDonald was making these really cool kind of embroidered clothing that she was wearing. And I'd been into 19th century art and the Pre-Raphaelites and all that kind of stuff. And I started to get really intrigued on what I learned was artistic dress. But everything I tried to go read about it was kind of very confused and sort of, sometimes it'd be called dress reform, sometimes it'd be called aesthetic dress. And it was usually always written about in art historical texts, and fashion history as a field. As an academic field, it's fairly newish. I mean, it's definitely a good half a century now where it's been building, but it's really kicked off over the last few decades. So there wasn't actually anything, there's a very little being written about this as a topic, and this confusion, that's where you find the gap, right? I was like, oh, there's actually a question to be answered here. So I ended up writing a whole PhD on how artists dressed in the 19th century to express their identity, and on artistic dress. And it was sort of a chronology of it from about 1848 through the end of the century. And yeah, so that is definitely one of my areas of expertise, and in theory, the subject of my next book, now that I can finally go back to it over a decade later, which is really good, because then I can start doing all the fun decolonizing stuff I really want to do with it. But yeah, it came out of Mackintosh's floppy bow tie.
You've mentioned the four as well, and we can come on to them in a bit. Well, it was surprising to me when I first went to the School of Art to sort of discover, I suppose, in a way, the polyphony that was in song at that time, at the time of the construction of the Glasgow School of Art at the Mackintosh building. And I hadn't realized kind of the role that other folk had played in the production of that epoch, of that moment, of that building. I suppose it would be an elegant thing to talk about the book itself. I mean, it seems fairly obvious why you should approach the Mackintosh building. Where did this book come out of? What was the motivation behind it?
So it did come out of the reconstruction project after the 2014 fire. So maybe, for anybody who's not fully aware of what we're talking about, I'll just draw a quick little timeline there of the Mackintosh building being considered, Charles Rennie Mackintosh's masterwork, and that's what previous books have called it, and been called about it. And so, on a lovely sunny day in 2014, when we were all getting ready for degree shows, you were there, Ambrose. The building caught fire, and it was, really horrific at the time, for all of us being very upset, because one of the key iconic rooms in the Mac was the library. And of course that was consumed, as well as the hen run at the top, the beautiful kind of glass pavilion, as Mackintosh called it. And we all stood outside kind of watching it burn. But actually, in hindsight, it was 10%, just 10% of the building was damaged. It was a critical 10%, including a portion of the building where a lot of the painting and furniture collection was stored. So that was lost. So anyway, on the back of that, there was a role created for a researcher to work alongside, because it was decided fairly quickly that, well, we have to rebuild it. And at that point, there's so much building left. The only option, the best option really is let's rebuild. So I became the Mackintosh Research Fellow there. And I was sort of meant to both sit alongside the project and kind of document it, and but also to help foster other people who wanted to do projects and things with the building. So I know we did some teaching around. I definitely did lots of teaching around. I can come back to that later. But anyway, the long story short is that when it was going to be reopened, it was decided, well, we should actually, we need to update the history of the building, because obviously every book out there is out of date now. It's had this huge fire. And through the restoration project, we are learning loads about the building we didn't know before. Again, we can come back to some of that stuff. But so let's capture this and let's put it out. And originally there was going to be kind of a really richly illustrated, beautiful book of photographs that I was writing kind of narratives to and whatever, alongside a more critical multi-volume sort of collection of essays from people working on the project. And this was all going to come out in around 2019 when the rebuilt building was going to be opened. And then 2018 happened, where the building caught fire again, as it was kind of getting toward the final stages of restoration and was destroyed. So at that point, I had to think, do I even write this now? What do I do? It was all very upsetting, to say the least. But I had lots of lovely people around me saying, "You've got to write it now. It's super important. Like this is the history. This is it." So, and Yale was incredibly supportive. So it went on for quite a while, waiting for fire reports and things and pandemics and going through stuff. So it only has come out this year, which is the 10th anniversary of the first fire, of course. So that's a bit of the journey of the book. It came out of the project. I think, yes, it was maybe a book that could have been written anyway, but there wouldn't have necessarily been a lot more to say to update the story from previous ones without actually that first fire coming in, because it was that the necessity of the restoration project that drove the really deep research that helped us understand so much more about the building and its history and what it looked like early days and all of that deep research. So sometimes out of tragedy, you can get these really, really fascinating projects, and it would have been nice if it had all worked out in a different way in 2019 as a reopened building instead of where we're at today. So
there's some photographs in the book which I haven't seen before of the restoration work just before that second fire, and it was looking really quite glorious. It would have been a wonderful thing. Thank you for that. It's a very interesting kind of origin story. I'm interested in your relationship to it as a design historian, or as a cultural historian.
All right, I can be a design historian in this one.
No, because one of the things that I was thinking about, and it might be nice to have a bit of an introduction into Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the Gang of Four. As a cultural historian, you're approaching the building from a very holistic background, and Mackintosh himself, to me, seems to be like one of these last great holistic designers. He's almost like the avatar, the ideal of what a contemporary or an architect could be. He's almost like a Renaissance figure. He did everything.
Yeah.
And that makes sense, therefore, as a cultural historian approaching him. He did fashion, did plays, did architecture, did art, did glass, did furniture, jewelry.
Yes. Textiles, metalwork. Yeah. A little bit of everything.
Tea rooms. I mean, yeah, it's a kind of amazing character, actually.
Yeah.
Like, it's beyond, I suppose, our comprehension. It's like no one could do it now. Not really. I mean, you get certain people.
Yeah.
Maybe Thomas Heatherwick. No, I'm only joking. Arnie Jacobsen got close. Arnie Jacobsen got close at St. Catherine's.
Yeah.
But
Well,
not many folk have. What's his background? How does he get to this? So obviously, you as a cultural historian makes sense of you being the person that writes this book about somebody who's more than an architect and a building that is in many ways more than architecture. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the origin story of Mackintosh and that movement.
Yes, I'm happy to. And then there's also a little piece which again, it sounds like it's about me, but about we'll go do that. And then something about, because I do think there's an approach I have to doing this that's maybe not strictly architectural history. So yeah, I mean, Mackintosh is, coming up in Glasgow as trained as most young architects at the time through apprenticeship, and, going into various firms and learning the trade, which was the way most architects were trained still at the end of the 19th century in the 1880s. And Glasgow at the time is, booming in terms of its growth and builds. Like most of the buildings we know and love in Glasgow were built in those years. A lot of them were. He's also slightly after the wonderful Alexander Thomson. So there's a lot of really great architecture and design already being established in Glasgow before Mackintosh, and work that is, if we're talking about sort of like the really highlight buildings, I would say work that is very much engaging with aestheticism, really, which is not something that gets talked about, I think, a lot in architecture. But that holistic approach to design. And we think, and we often like to jump to William Morris and things, but Thompson was a direct, sorry, and you've asked about Mackintosh and suddenly I'm talking about Thompson, but
No, Thompson is great too.
so the Thompson people will be thrilled. So Thompson was a direct contemporary with like Owen Jones and great designers who are making these pattern books for design and the kind of really richly decorated, tiles and color and all kinds of stenciling and everything, is going on. And he's working here in Glasgow with like Daniel Cottier and all of these wonderful. We had rich with people working in the arts and crafts trade. But the art school was sort of, without getting into the huge history of art schools, that's all in the book. But the art school was in many ways built to help service that Victorian industrial machine, and to produce designers and people who could help build Glasgow from that decorative side. So Mackintosh signs up for night classes at the school along with Herbert McNair, who was also working in the firm at the time. And he's just clearly, we don't, thing about Mackintosh is we don't know loads about him. He didn't leave lots of writing. He wasn't prolific in that way, like William Morris and other folk. So much has been pieced together about what we do know. But for whatever reasons, he decided that he wanted to study art and broaden his horizons and work in that way. And he was quite successful, and he won a traveling the Alexander Thompson Traveling Scholarship, actually. And he went to Italy and went around and sketched all kinds of things and came back. And the director of the school, so just to bear in mind, at the time that Mackintosh was a student there, of course, there was no Mackintosh building yet. Everybody was in the McClellan galleries on the top floor in these cram studios. And Francis Newbery was the director of the school. And I think that, although there's a broader reference to the four being, McNair, Mackintosh, McNair, and the MacDonald sisters, who they both married. Newbery is the fifth. I feel like it should be the five, possibly the sixth if you include his wife Jessie. So it was Newbery's vision, really, of the school. That was one of the things I think in the book I really wanted to highlight a bit more. That it was Newbery that wrote the brief for the school. Now the brief was built off of sort of like the South Kensington system and what art schools should look like and et cetera. But, there was a lot of the details and everything that he put in. And I think it was Mackintosh's vision of Newbery's ideal that got built ultimately. But yeah, he started working in other material, doing watercolors. Shall I segue to the four here? Because it's those.
Well, it sounds like a good idea, yeah.
So around 1894, they were exhibiting together. So sometime between 1892 and 94, Newbery, as the story goes, introduced them because he saw a kind of similar working style in their work. So the MacDonald sisters were actually born and raised in England and in Wolverhampton, outside of Wolverhampton in Tipton. And they moved up to Glasgow in the late 1880s when their brother became an attorney up here. They did have Scottish heritage, but were raised English essentially. And so they started taking classes in design as day students. And then they became part of a group of women friends who were working at the school that we now call the Immortals, because they called themselves that through this really cool zine, as we would call it, they produced called the magazine. And it was like a hand, there's these great, did you ever see it when you were here at GSA, the magazine? There's these 4 volumes, they're like albums of stories and drawings and all kinds of stuff, and they're all handwritten, but they're supposed to be a bit like the studio, and they've got like kind of witty commentary and They're absolutely amazing, but actually some drawings that you will be familiar with, like Mackintosh's Cabbages in the Orchard and some of the Tree of Personal Effort and Margaret MacDonald's A Pond, these were all in the magazine.
Mhm.
So they were like a collective, mostly of women artists that the men kind of hung around a little bit. And then within that, that's how they all met. And ultimately, McNair marries Frances MacDonald in 1899, and Mackintosh marries Margaret in 1900. But they had all been working collaboratively. And I think this is one of the tricky, fun, sticky issues. And this is what got me interested in their work, I think, originally, was that the narratives as they existed kind of early 20th century is that Mackintosh was this great architect designer, and unfortunately some of his early work was polluted by the feminine style of his wife, and oh, for shame, thankfully he got to the white wall eventually. I don't know, which he didn't actually. That's a myth. But yeah, I mean, there was some not public, but it was written mostly in letters. Like at his death, there was what's the architectural critic? Was it P. Morton Shand, who wrote a letter to William Davidson, who was organizing the memorial exhibit, and saying, I certainly hope you're not including the work of the others in this. It should just be Mackintosh, kind of thing. So there was a bit of that attitude later on. And then also, so one of the sort of nitpicky debates in the Mackintosh scholarly community, which I think has been mostly, it's not a debate anymore. We're much more egalitarian about how we give credit, is whether or not Margaret MacDonald does deserve any credit, so to speak, in these spaces that Mackintosh designed. And yes, Mackintosh was the architect for sure. But we don't, it's hard to quantify what happens when you're in an intimate creative partnership. Like we were just saying, you did this wonderful interview with Denise Scott Brown, who, she was talking about how, what did she say? She was the one who taught them what mannerism was, like, and yet it took so long to give her any sort of agency in that work. So because we don't have a lot of evidence, it's really difficult to kind of pick apart where, in some cases, where one begins and the other ends. So yes, Mackintosh was the architect. Yes, he definitely designed the spaces. It's not probably appropriate to say Margaret MacDonald was also the architect of like the Willow Tea Room or the Hill House or any other building like that. But in terms of the interior decoration, she did have a lot to do with it. She definitely made items, key critical items for these spaces, gesso panels, textiles, and things like that. And so we're starting to get into the danger zone of Robyne's giving a lecture on the floor, which I do all that I've done for many, many years now. But this is the key point. Okay, let me try to distill this down for you. So, Mackintosh is working, and the four are working in a symbolist art paradigm, which means that these interiors that they are making can actually be read. They can be interpreted. There are narratives within them. Sometimes they're obvious because they're based on poems or such. Sometimes they're really weird and you can't figure it out. And we can come back to that later talking about the Mac, because I think that's one of the takeaways from my book. But there is stuff going on in there. And if Margaret is making elements of a room that have to do with the narrative, then there's some kind of discussion that they're having there. There's some kind of creative, partnership that's going on. Janice Helen has written really beautifully about sort of the complications of collaborative relationships and especially when, that credit goes to one person and other people get marginalized. Quite often that creative partner, whether they're female, it's happened to men as well. So, But what we do know from Mackintosh is, there's kind of three quotes that always get pulled out. The one that gets pulled out the most is, I have talent, but Margaret had genius. That was actually a secondhand quote. So it's my least favorite one to use. It's like a friend of a friend said, kind of thing. When they were doing the gesso panels for the Ingram Street tea room, the first ones they did together, he wrote to Herman Mutasius and he said, just now we're working on these two panels from Miss Cranston's tea room. I'm working one, Margaret's working the other. We're working them together, and that makes the work quite pleasant, very pleasant, which is lovely. But what does that mean? You're working them together. That's the only line we have about them working together. So it's like, okay, are they in the same studio? Are they like saying, you do this, I'll do that? Like, we don't know what that looks like. But the best one to me is from a letter he wrote to her from Port Ventre, France, much later on. And she's in London, and it seems like she's going to be interviewed about his architectural work by some critic. And again, not having her letters, we don't know what she's asked or what she said, but this is where Mackintosh is like reassuring her that she knows what she's talking about to talk to this guy. And he writes to her, just remember, you are half, if not three-quarters, in all of my architectural work. He says very specifically architectural work. So at that point, it's like, all right, who are we? Who are we to start going, no, she wasn't, which some people do.
Yeah. I think that's interesting that you've used this thing that Mackintosh has no written down stuff, but he's got a lot of built work. And for me, one of the intriguing things about the Mac and his other work is that even though it's being built at the height of empire, and he is in the second city of the empire, Glasgow is built on colonialism as a financial system, but also as a kind of logic, a social logic, organizational hierarchical logic. His buildings don't, or their buildings, perhaps we should say, don't perform like perhaps we've become accustomed to thinking about colonial period buildings, empire buildings. They are discursive buildings. They are very urbane, where they are urban. But to me, the body of work surely is perhaps the strongest evidence that he was working in new ways, collaborative ways, because the buildings themselves not only encourage collaboration in their use, but communicate a kind of discourse-based, spatial, formal, aesthetic language. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say. And I think that idea of collaboration too, it's an interesting and again, thorny one because now see, I wouldn't, and I haven't argued that Margaret had any kind of real collaborative role in the Mac. She didn't really do anything or make anything for it. The early phase of its kind of vision, they weren't married yet. But I think, in a conceptual way, he was collaborating with Newbury, I think, and he certainly worked with all of the makers in the building, all the craftspeople, the joiners and everything. And I think in the library, there's some really interesting things that happened in terms of, he came up with a pattern for the pendants, but, how was that designed? I mean, we don't know. There's just so much we don't know. I do think, though, what do I want to say? Maybe I'll jump to what I ended up seeing in the building, if that's okay. So, and it's a kind of a story that does have to do with the pendant. So when I first started, and it actually maybe has to do with that question about me being a design historian and looking at that stuff. So the first time I went to a design meeting, and it should be mentioned here that the amazing Liz Davidson was a project manager, Sarah McKinnon, Liz was a senior project manager, Sarah was a project manager, and Paige Park were the lead architects. And I, again, was a, polymath historian, not knowing anything about what an actual building project was like. When I would go do our crits in School of Architecture, I was always the person sitting there for the aesthetics or doesn't seem to have sympathy with the environment. That's what I used to always say to students, but I didn't know anything about the project process. So it was really eye-opening to me to see like, oh, there's engineers here and there's guys who know about electricity here and all this stuff talking about this whole thing. So I went to my first design team meeting and I just was sitting in the back with my notebook. And they were talking about the rebuilding of the hen run, and that originally the hen run had this gridded roof instead of the pitched roof that we all knew, that was, because the flat grid that Mackintosh originally designed for what, again, on the drawings he called the glass pavilion, leaked immediately and always had structural problems, because he was kind of designing ahead of his time in terms of what technology could do well in this climate. So now we're in a space where we can easily, or more easily, build something like that and not have it fail and not have it leak. So there's this discussion around kind of, should they do that? And they found these early photographs in the building in our archives. By the way, one of the reasons this building could be rebuilt is GSA has arguably the largest archive of any art school of its history. So all of the ephemera and where stuff was purchased and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, we're looking at these photographs, and there's like these students in the hen run, and they're all sitting around, and I'm sitting in the back, and they're trying to determine the date of the photo to try to figure out when and how, when this changed, when the pitch roof came in. And David Page turned around and looked at me and he said, "What we need here is a fashion historian." And I was like, "Oh." And I went and I looked at the skirt, I looked at the hair. I'm like, I'd say 1914. And I was like, oh my God, I'm useful. Like, that's really cool. And it was really cool too, that I didn't know that he knew I had, who I was or what I did at all. And that he welcomed me into that space. And so from that point, I didn't just interject all the time, but I was welcome to add if I had something, to add to that conversation. So I'm trying to get back to your question here. So what ended up happening then was, sometimes when questions would come up, they'd shunt things my way as sort of the Mackintosh expert there. And we had lots of other people to ask who are in the community, obviously, Pamela Robertson, et cetera, things like that. But there was this minute where, and this is where it's hard to do, there's no visual. So hopefully people will look or know what the library looks like. It's a bit like a mini great hall, and there's a balcony level, and there's these pendants that hang down from this upper balcony, and they are all individually carved in different patterns on them. And and there was a minute where we didn't think we had detailed photographs of every single one of those. And we knew that they each had a different pattern on them. And so people started coming to me with different sets of data, and they were coming to me from different directions too. Like, even like the press officer was asking me questions, and all the questions were around, like, Robyne, do you know what they meant? Do you know what the patterns meant? Like, they had a secret. And if you ever went on a tour of the library, they would talk about that. They'd say, like, oh, we don't know. Could it be a system for cataloging the books? Are they musical notes? Like, people would just, we always said they were like kind of seeds in the forest. That was the natural motif of that whole room being like a forest. That was always the interpretation that was discussed. But so people were asking me, what do they mean? And I found myself constantly explaining what symbolist art was to people and saying, it's giving you a set of ideas for you to kind of determine what yourself. There's no solid meaning here. There's no clear black and white. It's whatever that's how it works, right? The pleasure is in the kind of interpretation of the audience. But then I realized that I had all these different bits of data from different places. And when I say data, I mean like images and questions and discussions and video and things like that. And I sat down here. I was an art school student once upon a time, many, many years ago. And I was sitting here, literally, I was sitting right here, actually, where I'm sitting now on my sofa. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to draw them. I'm going to take out my sketch pad and I'm going to start drawing these and see if I see anything. And almost immediately I saw it, that there were really only 3 different patterns on there that had been arranged. They're like these long, arrangements of seed forms. And there was just 3 of them, but they'd all been arranged in different ways. So if you say each pattern was ABC, one pendant might go ABC, CBA. Another one might go CAB, CAB. and they were just, it was the same pattern, but just each one had a different arrangement. And with one of the videos, I couldn't see the detail of the pattern, but I could see how long the gap was in the bottom to figure out which one was which. So I was actually able to draw the entire thing out as a plan. And I was so like pleased with myself. I was like, oh my God, I've figured this out. And I went in and I gave it to David Page, and everyone was like, oh, amazing job. And literally like 2 days later, they found an entire set of photographs stuck in someone's drawer of all of them, but we knew where they were in the room. So anyway, that was really fun. The reason I'm telling you this self-aggrandizing story is this, though. What that process really made me do was think about the fact that everybody, they didn't ask, what did they look like? Everybody asked me, what do they mean? As if there was like this code that could be unlocked to crack the sequence of what the decorative program was. And I thought that's really interesting. It's what these little seed patterns do and did on the tours and everything is get everybody's mind going, get them asking questions, get them kind of the intellectual spark running. And guess what? What room are you in when this is happening? You're in a library. You're in a library.
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to do. They're sparking your intellectual faculties. The design is kind of inspiring you to think. And that's what the room is for. And I thought that to me was really exciting and interesting and nerdy as a design historian, that everybody seemed to have that kind of experience with them. And I thought, gosh, I wonder if it's like that in the rest of the building. And going back to the hen run, and you'll remember Ambrose. Anyways, the hen run's this big, like this lovely glass pavilion, and it's attached to the loggia, or the loggia, as I would have said. Loggia, as everyone says here in Scotland, that had these folding desks with these arched gridded windows. And I did know already from, I don't know where, but the history of what I knew of the building is that, if you sat, and also I guess being an art student, if you were to sit at those desks that fold up and draw, you could use that grid to kind of map out the city, help you to mark where things are. So then I started thinking like, well, that's interesting. That whole pathway up there could have to do with drawing, because when I sat in Page Park looking at those drawings of the hen run where they'd mocked up the grid, it looked like a 1-point perspective. It looked like orthogonals, and because they'd done a Photoshop of the sun coming in, and suddenly the whole thing actually had a vanishing point in the center of the arch on the other end. And I thought, well, you could sit at the end of the hen run and understand 1-point perspective if the sun was at the right apex in the sky. And I'm like, what else does the building do? And I started wondering about, and the thing is, the studios just provide you good studio space, I think. But then you had like the little niches in the building that, and because I did a lot of oral history interviews for this book, I got people's memories from what they remembered. And I had lots of people tell me, he just seemed to like know where to put places where you could sit and rest and meet other people, or sit and think and be inspired. And there was this kind of thing about, so I think this is a very long way of getting back to what you were asking about in the beginning, of just how these spaces worked and how there's a kind of, so I've proposed, I feel like there's just a very intuitive kind of, maybe subconscious level in which they're very clever. And some of them are just spaces that work the way they need to very functionally. And then some of them are spaces that have that little added extra to kind of get you going in the direction that you want to be going in that space, I suppose. So I think maybe that's a bit of design history and art history, and the kind of way I would interpret paintings and gesso panels and things of looking at a building that for me, I always got very excited about.
I like this idea a lot. The building was a very generous building. It dignified human action, the ordinary activities of learning art by sometimes completely rudimentary, shall we say, students of art, but given these extraordinary spaces. And as you say, they're just big cubes, really, some with a nice big north light to the big studios, but they were hugely dignifying. But I was also thinking about this thing that you were talking about, this symbolist art paradigm. And I wanted to use it as a kind of segue to talk about the relationship of the building to the city. And obviously you've talked about the idea in the hen run in the loggia of these kind of grids allowing you to map out the city. And I was thinking also about the way that the kick plates on the front doors, as you go up the stairs and into the building, the kick plates form a smile. And as you go out of the building, back down the stairs, they form a kind of unhappy mouth, as if you're, which I thought was, I was
About that, and I love it. If you'd said that to me, I would have quoted you in the book. That's amazing.
But also the way that bottom step, this was something, I can't remember who pointed this out to me. It might have been Colin Porteous. The bottom step of the building stepped onto the pavement like a little bit of tongue.
Yeah.
It was like everything about the building was about the city. And I was wondering, when the building was built, how was the building received by the city? And obviously that transformation over time, because when it went up in smoke in 2014 and then 2018, the outpouring of, particularly, I think, the 2014 fire was met by a genuine level of sadness,
Yeah.
which corresponded to something far beyond what a normal building would be felt about. And for me, that was something to do with this urban kind of engagement. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's very fair. Briefly on the first part of your question, there's not a ton out there about the reception, like loads and when it was, because it was built in these two phases, there's almost a 10-year gap in between where kind of you got used to this half of a slightly odd building with technical studios stuck to it. That was the east end of the building, and then they went and built the rest of it. So it had this phased opening to it. It was definitely celebrated at the time, but there's a bit in my book where a little bit later, shortly after its opening, some students kind of wrote in a student magazine about it, and they were calling it to be almost like eccentric and in a bit of a derogatory way, but that it worked. They liked it, but almost against it was a weird building. It was just, kind of the thing, which I thought was really fun. And I did quote a little bit of that because I thought it wasn't something I'd read loads in a lot of the literature. And I thought it was really interesting. I mean, yes, over time it became I think I wouldn't be debated too hard to say that building was the heart of the city. That it was voted the most loved building in Britain, right? In 2012. And the best building most in Britain, something. I'm blanking which. So it over time, it definitely became, people were so proud of it. And loads of people never went in. I can't talk to the number of people who've said to me, of all ages, I was never inside and I wish I had been. But they knew it. Everybody knew it. And they were proud of it. I think maybe not everybody loved it. I definitely talked to people who were like, I don't get it, I don't get. And maybe those are people who only ever saw it from the back and never went up to see the front too. Who knows? But surely they would have seen it in images. But it was a symbol of the city, and it was a symbol of the creativity of the city for sure. Like, more recently, the statistics about how we've turned out more Turner Prize winners. I mean, they were all students from the 1980s and such, 90s, I think. But it's that idea that this is a creative place, an industrious place, and so I think you're absolutely right. In 2014, I mean, people just felt heartbroken and sad. And there was so much love that went out for the building at that time. There was so much like support, and it must be rebuilt. And, there were very few naysayers. And I think I don't know what the deal is with some of the people who were like, yeah, I can't. And this is another place where it's kind of, I think, and I know I'm not alone in this, it's not unique or anything, but my perspective of buildings is that, there's this sense for some folk that they're these like, and this is, again, I talk about this book, that there's like fixed monuments. We think of buildings as like these iconic things that don't change. And they're symbols of, I don't know, who are our cities and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, that's completely wrong. Buildings change almost more than anything. They change through our use, they change through our interaction, we damage them, we alter them, we do all kinds of stuff, and they're meant to change. They're not fixed monuments at all. And being a design historian, like no one would blink an eye at duplicating, and they have done loads of Casina, Mackintosh chairs. Like nobody blinks an eye at making a copy of a chair, but you suddenly make a copy of a building and it's like, what are you doing? The material is gone, SPAB manifesto. I don't know. It's just all like, people freak out because, and it's like, well, okay, no, it's not going to have all those scratches and dings again. And that was part of the conservation approach too. But people were like, I remember actually being in a session. It was actually in the Bourdon building. We had this Mackintosh thing and discussion, and there was this debate, and I was chairing it or something. Yeah, I was chairing it. I don't remember. Anyway, it's all vague. Anyway, at the end, this guy in the back's like, if you destroyed the Mona Lisa, you wouldn't repaint it. And I said, no, but they knocked the nose off the Pietà and they stuck it back on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or more recently, in about 7 minutes, they've managed to rebuild Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And no one now is really looking at that and going, I wish we had made it into a giant glass swimming pool. Because that was one of the proposals, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Really devastating for the reputation of architects worldwide. I think that those proposals were, but yeah, no one questions that, and obviously that remains the case. I want to finish on this. What is the likely future? Obviously, there was recent news about the mothballing of the renovation efforts, and I didn't read much about it. I just saw 1 or 2 news stories about it, and we don't want to go into the kind of technical and legal and potentially legalistic side of that. As a design historian, what do you feel is now, given the absolute ruination of the building, what do you feel is the best approach that we might take? Do you actually think that there is a chance of rebuilding it?
Yes, I do. And I think it's the right, I think that's what should be done. So I am happy to, I'll give a little bit more detail on that. And it's not legalistic, because mostly the good news is what I know, because I'm not involved with the project, is basically what's out in the press. So there's no blinking again, but then I give my opinion. So basically, they did a big business case to say what would be the best option on this one. And actually, dovetailing on your last question, where we were saying everyone was super sad in 2014, in 2018, everyone was just super angry. Real anger. And it was hard. And it was hard to be involved, hard to be in it. And understandable anger, and it affected the people who lived there for a really long time. And so it's been very, very controversial. There was a parliamentary hearing over the whole thing. And so anyway, this time they had to be like, last time it was Muriel Gray standing on the hill going, we'll rebuild it, and everyone going, yay. And we just did that. And nobody really, this time they had to really put a case forward about, okay, what is the best option here, really, really? And they explored everything from a total demolition and rebuild to faithful reconstruction. And it was deemed that faithful reconstruction was the best way forward, economically, in terms of heritage, et cetera, et cetera. So they did a huge bureaucratic exercise to come up with the same answer, really, which is just the way of the world. I get why they had to do it. For all the reasons, you and I can sit and laugh at the irony that it's the same answer. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. They went forward and they did the whole tender and everything like that. And then, yeah, they were, at the time we thought we would have an announcement of who the next design team was. There was an announcement that it had been a failed exercise due to an error in the scoring matrix, which is, least can you not, and this is Robyne speaking now, Robyne's caption, Robyne's opinion. Can you please just explain to us what stuff means? And I think this is, unfortunately, some of that ill will that's out there is around this perception that there's, silence and secrets and all kinds of stuff, when actually I think it's just like that extreme and reasonable fear of all kinds of litigation when you're in the middle of something that is a major kind of, they have insurance they have to deal with, who's at fault, there's so much that they've got to figure out. I get why they're skittish, but what I think then when things aren't like explained in a more transparent way, it's just another kind of fodder to the people who think they're just keeping secrets from everybody. And it actually has to do with something, as it's been explained to me like 4 times, Ambrose, but again, this is where I'm still the design historian. I'm like, procurement, what? There's
Yeah.
something problem with Scottish procurement, and it's a big old mess, and it has to do with how they value, how they add value and score things and whatever. So there was an error, and so they had to scrap the whole thing to be fair. And now they're going out and doing another business case. I don't quite understand that part of it, if I'm honest with you. I guess it's because, well, you had that great, I don't know if you saw that little, Chipperfield gave that talk earlier in the year. I managed to just stick it in my book, like literally the week before it was going to press. But he was talking about, and he did visit. I don't know if you were here when he came up, and I got to chat with him, and it was great. And so he saw it, and he was like, this is a building that needs to be rebuilt. Like, that's the option for it. But this talk he gave in February, he said something like, but now the problem is the economics. Like, how can you justify? Because the longer it sits, and again, to be fair to the art school, it looks to everybody like it's just been sitting in silence. And I can tell you it has not. There has been a constant program of work, from clearing out the ruins and debris of the building to stabilizing the walls. And there is a lot of building left, by the way. I've been inside of it. It's like a big old Linlithgow Palace ruin in there now. Looks, if you like ruins, it's a pretty good one. But it is depressing. But there's loads of building left, and particularly, lovely exterior stuff. So you kind of got to deal with it. But with, the world, let's just put the world and the state of it in a big old umbrella there. The cost is just up and up and up and up and up. It's going to be astronomical. So, and then it's about, can you, the justification of that against, the needs of the city and all the work that's going on and people going to food banks and whatever, and so it's a very different world and situation since 2014.
Yeah.
So yes, I do think it can. I know, well, no, I don't think. I know 100% it can be rebuilt. Like, there's no doubt in my mind. We know how, we have the information. This time there's a 3D scan of the building. We get it. Like, it can be done. It's going to take a really long time. And again, my personal opinion, I have now been slowly drifted over to the camp of, it might be a good idea to appoint an external trust or body or something to do it. But I don't think that will ever happen. And it doesn't have to. It's their building. At the end of the day, Scottish Parliament has said they won't get involved because it's their building. They own it. It's their property. So
My. It's complicated stuff, isn't
it's
it?
very complicated. But it will be interesting to see what that project does look like, because, it will be a new build in many ways. It does need to be more sustainable. I don't think it can be built like for like this time. I mean, there was such a huge thing about finding, what was it? 4 Douglas fir beams to rebuild Studio 58 that they ended up finding this was the kind of work that was being done in the first project. It was, a mill that was being dismantled in Massachusetts, and they managed to find these huge beams, 8 of them, brought them over, got them prepared. They prepared 1, it was fine. Prepared 2, it was fine. Prepared 3, it was fine. Prepared the 4th, it cracked. I'm generalizing here on what it did. It failed. The 5th one failed. The 6th one failed. The 7th one failed. And then the 8th one was okay. And they got 4 beams that they needed, something like that. Now you've got the entire roof of the museum to build similar beams. So it's like the resource, they're going to have to make some difficult decisions around where, the library, I think, will be rebuilt again as it was. And in fact, a lot of that bespoke work, those lovely pendants and everything, they're in Edinburgh. They weren't installed yet. So some of the work still exists. Some of the work we know exactly how to redo it. And then other spaces are going to have to be done, I don't know, flat pack. I'm just kidding. We used to make a lot of jokes about flat pack Mac, actually. We should have.
Maybe they can just give everybody a VR headset as you go up Socky Hall Street so that it just feels like it's there. And then,
well, the funny thing is you literally could do that because there is a whole scan of the building. And one of the projects I was trying to do while I was there was to get that an actual VR version. I called it, oh yeah, of course. I called it DRAM, the Digital Research Atlas of the Mac.
oh my gosh.
And it was a whole project. That was one of the things I was trying to do and get it. And so it would have been a whole kind of like, yeah.
Fantastic. I could listen to you talk about it all day, but we haven't got all day.
You don't.
I think that's a wonderful point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Robyne. I've really enjoyed hearing you.
Thank you so much, Ambrose. It's been delightful to chat with you.
There's hope in honest error, so said Charles Rennie Mackintosh himself. Thank goodness it was then. Thanks to Robyne for taking the time to speak with me and for being such a wonderful guest. Thanks to Yale University Press for the PDF too. See the podcast descriptions for links to the book and to Robyne's professional and social profiles. And thanks for listening.